Hey you all, today we're going to be talking about Reconstruction. So Reconstruction, very simply put, is what it sounds like. It is the government trying to reconstruct the Union or pull the Confederate States after the Civil War back into unity with the North. There are many issues, of course, that come out of this. It is, how do we put the South back together? The South is in ruins. There's just rampant destruction. There's questions over congressional representation. Will the old representatives and senators and politicians come back in and play the same part that they did before? The issue of slavery pushed us into civil war, and then eventually the federal government began rethinking the status of slaves as they began to emerge to self-liberate themselves during the Civil War. And then the question is what is their place in society now that the war is over? The South surrendered at Appomattox in January of 1865, and Lincoln was assassinated just months later in April of 1865 as well. Obviously threw some major wrenches in the Reconstruction plan for the South that had been orchestrated during the Civil War. One of the major kinks in the Reconstruction process that happened was Lincoln's successor. We have a very different perspective that emerges as the national leader, and this has really profound implications. So Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's successor. He was Lincoln's vice president. After Lincoln was assassinated, he became president. Andrew Johnson was very interesting in the sense that he mirrored in a lot of ways a lot of the characteristics of Andrew Jackson. If you remember, Andrew Jackson was this Southern self-made common man advocate, very violently opposed to elite privilege, also very racially hierarchical, racist in many ways, explicitly. A lot of those characteristics we're also going to see in Andrew Johnson. And just like Andrew Jackson, despite those characteristics, he was a state unionist. This is true for Johnson as well. The problem is that Andrew Johnson didn't make friends very easily. He's going to vigorously resist the old established elite in the South, but he's also going to have no intentions of giving black people in the South political or economic advantages or equality either. So if we understand Andrew Johnson's position, his outlook on life, we can understand this battle that begins to happen very quickly in 1865, and that will really continue over the next 2 years, and then will kind of play out after Johnson is out of office on a national scale even after that. Johnson hated Northern radicals. He hated anyone that was advocating for abolition. He did not believe in black political equality, economic equality. He also hated large elite plantation owners in the South. He hated the wealthy just like he hated abolitionists as well. He's going to very quickly resist political equality, black voting, protection of black rights, the use of the federal government to make the southern states treat black people with any kind of equality. And so essentially Johnson's plan for Reconstruction, or putting the Union back together, is just that the Union they have to come back, they have to capitulate to the North, and they have to accept the 13th Amendment, or the amendment that says that slavery is over. Now, beyond that, there's not much protections in Johnson's mind that the federal government should extend to black people in the South to protect them from exploitation, violence, or subjugation really to any degree. If you think about the platform of the Republican Party was preserving wage labor in the West, was pumping money into infrastructure, creating railroads, economic opportunity. It wasn't civil rights, but this kind of fringe idea of radical republicanism that did believe that there should be political equality to black people in the South begins to become increasingly mainstream when they see that if the federal government doesn't interject itself into the South, that the South is going to look very much like it did before the Civil War, after the Civil War. So with Johnson in the presidency, the South begins to institute a series of things that begin to suppress black movement, black autonomy, black rights, all throughout the South. So we'd seen that there were those slave codes in Virginia that early in the, throughout the 1600s had begun to systematically take away certain rights. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, things that we think of as inherent rights that get enshrined in the Bill of Rights. That created that racial inequality in Virginia, and eventually cemented that racial slavery that exists really after 1705 in Virginia. Essentially what we have after the Civil War and Reconstruction is a repeat of that. So southern states, Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, all of these states in the South begin to institute black codes. And essentially what those are they are restrictions around black freedom. So the inability to own guns, not being able to testify in court, insulting white people in public is criminal, obviously not being able to vote, heavily taxed or even jailed if you don't do anything but agricultural labor. So you can see how they're trying to pull people in back into essentially recreating the Old South in the post-slavery world. One of the central issues here is the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery in 1865 says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except for a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. What's happened here is the 13th Amendment has left a loophole that says forced servitude can happen in cases where people can be duly convicted of a crime, right? So what happens under these black codes is they begin to pass this notion that if freed people do not have a working contract, usually in the agricultural field, oftentimes with the person who previously enslaved them, then they can be convicted for a crime, typically vagrancy, and then they can be auctioned out in order to fulfill that payment that was due. So you can see how that there is a loophole where these southern states are really trying to create the Old South again. And the problem here is that Johnson does not believe the federal government should step in and fight that injustice that's beginning to happen. One of the outworkings of black codes is the emergence of sharecropping, where someone can sign a contract and essentially it says that they will work the year and then whatever portion of the crop at the end of the year, then they can partake in that. So it looks like a form of contract or negotiated agricultural capitalism in a sense. But the outworking of this is that written into these is, there will be money taken out for tools, for housing, for all of these other stipulations that go into the process of bringing this to fruition. And so the outworking is if there's not a good crop or if there's no way to accumulate wealth, right? There's a small portion that gets passed down minus all of the things that lead up to that. So essentially this is an intentional method of preventing freed people in the South and poor white people sometimes as well from accumulating any kind of wealth and economic independence. So you can see with the institution of the black codes and then the emergence of sharecropping how there was essentially a recreation of the Old South after 1865. And the issue here that the Republican Congress in the North is how do we deal with this? What makes matters worse is in 1865 there are congressional elections, and what happens is these old Congress people, these literally politicians in the South, people like Alexander Stephens, who we've read, who literally were at the heart of this treasonous war that happens, are voted back into Congress. So in the Northern Mind, there was literally 5 years of bloodshed where millions of people died, and all of a sudden the people that instigated this in their mind are coming back in and taking their seat right next to them in Congress. The emergence of black codes, the proliferation of sharecropping, and then all of a sudden these southern politicians coming back into the North. So Northern Republicans in Congress, because of those three things, believe that it is their role to get involved in the South and to make sure that the new Union going forward doesn't look like the Old South from previous. So congressional Republicans do a number of things. One, they pass a bill extending the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau is essentially a federal organization which would come down into the South and help free people negotiate contracts. It would help divvy up land squabbles. It would create schools, help create churches, essentially create social stability in the South. It was very imperfect. It was paternalistic in a lot of ways. It was concentrated in certain areas. It didn't exist in others, but it did provide a necessary sense of stability and resources for many freed people in the South. Johnson vetoes the extension of the Freedmen's Bureau, and Congress overrides that veto very quickly. Next, Congress tries to pass a Civil Rights Act, essentially giving black people full and equal benefits of the law. This is working in tandem as they begin to work towards the 14th Amendment that would give citizenship to freed people, ex-slaves in the South. When Congress puts forth the Civil Rights Act, Johnson vetoes that, and Congress overrides that veto. And you can see that there is this very aggressive back and forth that begins to happen between a president that doesn't think that there should be any protections for freed people in the South, and that there is an increasingly interventionist Congress that says it is the job of the Republican government to ensure economic stability, political rights, and equality of citizenship for ex-slaves in the South. The back and forth between Johnson and Congress really kind of hits ahead in 66 and 67. First, the 14th Amendment is passed. Passed in 66. It takes 2 years to become ratified. But essentially what that says is it amends the Constitution to say that if you are born on American soil, then you are an American citizen. Notice the significance of this. What this is saying is that if you are born on American soil, you have all of the rights and due process of all other citizens, right? So this is citizenship equality that this is putting forward. Not only does it have long-lasting implications for not just freed people, but also immigrants, and then later even things like marriage equality. Just as significant, this will nullify that Dred Scott decision. Remember, the 1850s, the Supreme Court said in Dred Scott that black people could not appeal to the Supreme Court because they did not have the same rights as white people did in America. And what the 14th Amendment will do is it will nullify, it will overturn that decision, and it will say if you were born on American soil, then you have the ability to appeal to the law. You have every access to rights and privilege that every other citizen has. Johnson hates this, but what really gets him in trouble is this Military Reconstruction Act of 1867. Congress realizes is the president isn't going to help, and the states are going to continue to pass these black codes that recreate an old South in a post-Civil War world. And so what they do is they say that Northern Army has to go down and occupy the South, that they literally chop up the South into 5 districts and they put generals over them. And so what happens is Johnson begins to push back and he says, well, if I can't override this, I vetoed this, it gets overridden every time that there's this back and forth. What he does is he begins to try to pull out who is appointed to those positions in order to put someone in that is more sympathetic with his position. You can see where he's trying to kind of backdoor things and control. And essentially what this does is this gets him impeached for overreaching his authority. They weren't able to get enough votes to push Johnson out of office, but after his impeachment, he begins to mellow out and Congress begins to move to the forefront in the Reconstruction process. Another significant turning point is 1869 when the 15th Amendment is passed. The 15th Amendment is very significant in the sense that it prohibits states from keeping anyone from voting based on race alone. If we say that voting suppression cannot be based on race, there are obvious holes with that. Up until this point, abolitionists and women's rights activists had worked together. If you remember, if you look through that Elizabeth Cady Stanton document, those Declaration of Sentiments, where she talks about the inequality of women in the 19th century, Frederick Douglass was one of the men that signed that. He agreed. There was this coalition that began to happen. And when black men on paper get the right to vote, this begins to galvanize. It pulls the women's movement apart from the abolitionist, or now the movement for black equality in the South. Just as problematic, there are other loopholes that states begin to push. So there are poll taxes, grandfather clause, literacy tests. Essentially what states begin to do is they begin to move and they begin to institute prohibitions that don't explicitly appeal to race but have racial implications. A grandfather clause saying, if your grandfather was not free, then you're not able to vote. Poll taxes, having to pay a tax that would make you eligible to vote. Or literacy tests, sometimes the ability to read, but sometimes even way more difficult things like knowing obscure things about a state constitution that really no one would know anyway, and that were only pulled in times where black people were trying to come to vote. It's very clear how these were intentional methods of suppressing black political action without appealing to race explicitly. Now, in many places, military reconstruction was effective. So it was the case that the occupation of the North into the South, the extension of Northern people coming down to make sure that the 14th Amendment, Civil Rights Act, that these things that were being instituted by Congress in order to afford economic ability, political action, were actually being enforced, and that black people had access to these things. For a short period of time, there was an explosion of black political engagement. There were, I think, 14 black congressmen that emerged during this period of time. There were hundreds that end up helping recreate state constitutions, that take governor's offices, that take all kinds of political offices from post offices to governors throughout the South. This is actually wildly successful. Not only do you have an explosion of effective black politicians, but you also have a huge black voting bloc that helps perpetuate the Republican government in the North after Johnson leaves office. This short period of time, this explosion of black political engagement that really would be unparalleled in the 20th century, was short-lived, unfortunately. And there's a couple reasons for this. One, if you remember, the role of the Republican Party was never a civil rights organization. The primary goal was economic stability, westward expansion, the creation of a more stable, larger federal government. It wasn't the perpetuation of a civil rights movement. It doesn't take long before Republicans begin to show their true colors, and they begin to pull back from what is a long and hard-fought battle for equality in the South. To make matters worse, in 1866, the KKK emerges in Pulaski, Tennessee. And here you have this movement founded by ex-Confederate soldiers Southerners that begins to violently suppress any kind of equality in the South. So think about what the KKK is. It's essentially a domestic terrorist organization that functions as an unofficial wing of the Democratic Party in the South throughout the 1860s. Not only were many of these ex-Confederate soldiers, but many of them were also doctors, community leaders, politicians, policemen. They're integrated into the larger society of the South, and they use terror, lynching, violence, death in order to try to recreate the South that existed before the Civil War. With the KKK working outside of the realm of traditional politics, you also have large-scale movements within politics in order to be able to push Democratic prominence back to the forefront in the South. And what's interesting about this is this movement to recreate the Old South overturned black political engagement and put white politicians back in the South. Those that would push to reinstitute this would call themselves the Redeemers. And this is a very unsettling point in the sense that the KKK and these Redeemer governments would appeal to an old version of the South, but they would also appeal to Christianity. They called themselves the Redeemers, and they thought that they were going to redeem society from what they saw as the overextension of equality, very much in the sense of that Alexander Stephens cornerstone speech, where they saw white supremacy and racial hierarchy as coextensive with Christianity in the South. Eventually, Northern Republicans would grow tired of fighting with the South. The Republican Party would turn back towards the things that it always had been mostly devoted to, particularly subduing the Western frontier and establishing a stable and growing concrete economy. Reconstruction eventually came to an end in 1877. Its end is marked with a presidential election. Samuel Tilden versus Rutherford Hayes, 1877. Tilden won the popular vote, and Hayes had a questionable electoral win. 3 states were not even counted. Eventually this goes to Congress, and what comes out of this is often referred to as the compromise or this corrupt bargain that emerges in 1877, where Hayes says if the presidency is given to him that he will pull the military out of the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. This is what happens. As we go forward, we're going to see the problems with this, but without the stability that the military occupation of the South offered, it very quickly paved the way for the institution of Jim Crow that would define the South for a century to come.